Hello, my name is Mihai Zodian, and this is the second seminar about strategic studies. Today we'll be speaking about civil military relations. This is a short outline, so we'll have an introduction, main arguments, case studies, definitions, several themes, and conclusions. At the end of this video, the audience should have a better mastery of the following issues like the waves of civil military relations, major themes, evaluations criteria, and theories. This video is based on a seminar that I taught recently, and I thank Mr. Radu Cucută for allowing me to use part of this seminar for this session. And the text is Civil Military Relations by Mackubin Thomas Owens, which is published at the Oxford Research Encyclopedia. It's basically a synthesis, kind of a review of several main themes and of theories and a critical analysis of them. So it's a very good text for introduction in this subject. Okay, so why do we speak about civil military relations? One way to argue their importance is to look at news. So I look at the Associated Press and have two recent news. One is that ICE replaces a contractor at its largest detention camp after it was criticized for bad living conditions. This is one news, and why it matters because ICE is part of this issue of civil military relations, and its stand on immigration and its policy on immigration are highly contested by let's say civilians in the United States. So it's an issue related to civil military relations. The other is another news from Associated Press about Kim Jong Un and his teenage daughter who went to shooting practice. Now, this is the other extreme in which the political factors have a strong influence upon our armed forces. They basically subordinate them even in details. Okay, so from Owen's text, there are three main arguments. One, that from the many research teams related to civil military relations, the most important or the most discussed is that of political control. And this theme of political control is discussed in the perspective proposed by Samuel Huntington in the 1950s of the last century. So uh, a lot of time has passed since then. But this theory is important because this theory is basically the framework of reference for both academics and for decision makers. It was very influential after the fall of communism, as we will see. The other argument is that all these theories are very criticized because they are limited, empirical, and they were reformed and restated several times. The last major argument is that civil military relations also influence strategic thinking. For example, if political factors are too influential or if your ideology is too influential, the threats can either be overstated or understated. So we have also several case studies. One is the 6th January insurgency in the United States, where when the armed forces kept to their tradition of neutrality. So this tradition of neutrality is recommended and emphasized by Samuel Huntington. It's basically the main model of democratic relations, but it's not the only one. Another case study is about various military dictatorships, especially the one established by Napoleon, who's another model of political regime, like the modernizing military. And this model was influential in new states which were formed after the fall of several empires. Now is not very influential, but historically was important. Another case study is China, where the leader Xi Jinping is doing a today, so these days or recently has done a purge of his military, and it's the third or the second or the third purge since he took power more than a decade ago. And we speak about this because it has both domestic or political value, political importance, and because it may influence the relationship with the United States. So it has both ethical issues, and it raises ethical issues, and it also raises strategic issues. For example, case study is the 1989 revolution in Romania, where the armed forces were important in the repression and in the change of power. So, for domestic reason and for historical reason, in case of Romania, and the last case study is that of Prussia. Prussia was of sometimes called an army of a state, and the Prussian militaries was considered a cause of war. So we may speak about civil military relations when we may be interested in them to avoid wars. Okay, so now we look at the definitions from Owen's text. One is, what are civil military relations? He defines civil military relations as the interaction between the armed forces of a state as an institution and the other sector of the society. Here, armed forces are not simply the military. Armed forces is kind of a wider concept which includes anyone who is employed in national security. For example, intelligence services, diplomats, and so on, the police, and so on. Okay, so when you speak about the civil military relations, we basically speak about the relations between the society as a whole and several sections of the state. So it's not just the people in uniform. Okay, the other concept is the civil military problematic. So why do we study civil military relations? Because it's like a dilemma, and at one horn of this dilemma is that the armed forces shouldn't be too strong, because if they are too strong, they may overrule the politicians and sometimes install dictatorships. The other side of the dilemma is that if the armed forces are too weak, they cannot do their job. So the state, the society is under threat. So in between these extremes, the civil military relationship studies look for a compromise. One compromise is the objective political control. This is the essence of Samuel Huntington's prescription, and he argued that professionalism is a way out of this dilemma. So the military should have full power to pursue their job in a niche. This niche is the national security, defense, and so on. But the politicians, the political system should have overall guidance, so should define the goals and so on, and the values. So if you keep the armed forces in their autonomous sphere, the problem of political control will be solved. There are several waves of civil military studies. Now we are at the themes of this domain. The first wave was the after World War II, and it was about the relationship between the armed forces and the political system, so question of regime. It was important for two reasons. One, that is that the United States had for the first time in its history a permanent military national security structure. The traditional model in the United States was you fight a war, you send the army home, and you return to peace. Then you fight another war, you send most of the army home, and so on. Now, after World War II, because of the Cold War, the United States established a permanent structures, permanent institutions for national security, like the Pentagon, the CIA, and so on. Now, this raises obviously several issues of political control, and Samuel Huntington offered a solution. And also Maurice Yanovitz was an alternative. Now, the second reason was that the European empires fell, and instead of them, new states appeared. So in these new states, they needed to establish their own models, and the issue of political control was important because sometimes the military was stronger than the politicians. The military in these states inherited the colonial forces, so they had a longer tradition and they were more stable. So they could be a threat, and in many of them, the armed forces took power. So it was for these two reasons the most developed studies, traditional studies about political control, were written after the Second World War. Then there is another wave during the dance of the 70s and so on, when the issue of, let's say, the Cold War was entering the more calmer phase called the detente, and the specter of war wasn't so imminent for the Western armed forces. And the third wave was the post-Cold War period. Again, political control was important for similar reasons, like in the 1950s, there were new independent states who wanted to build democracies, and they asked for guidance. So Samuel Huntington's theory was the basis for political reform and security sector reform, and this happened also in Romania. So in Romania, there is an important author, Marian Zulean, who wrote about civil military studies and who translated several fundamental texts. And he argued that this importance of Huntington had its some vulnerabilities or some bad sides. One, because Samuel Huntington's theory is not perfect and it ignores local context. So you need to find a compromise between general theories and specific characteristics. The other issue is what are the main themes, why we so the subjects which are treated in these civil military relations. The most important is who controls the armed forces, and here this depends on the interaction between the politicians, the society, and the military. Now, Owens here is influenced by Karl von Clausewitz, who is basically the one of the most important strategists in the West. And in his first chapter from On War has a thread. And the first Trinity is about the people, the military, and the political system. So, uh, strategy sometimes has this political counterpart. So the fundamental question from Plato is who was the guardians, who controls the armed forces. The other issue, the second issue, is what influence is legitimate for the armed forces to have. And we saw that for Huntington is the professionals, the board of professionals define the legitimate use of the authority for the armed forces. Another issue is about missions. And we see, for example, that in democracies, the missions of the armed forces are mostly oriented toward outside, to counter outside enemies, outside threats, while in the dictatorships, the armed forces have also this function of repression, so political repression. So, upon the quality of political control, the mission depends too. Another question from the civil military relations, who serves. For example, you can have an army based on recruitment, or you can have a professional army in which you have basically the military like employees. And this is also related to the way threats are perceived, but also with the quality of the political regime. And the last issue identified by Owens is about efficiency and effectiveness. So efficiency, if you use the resources available in the best possible way, and effectiveness is if you do your job. More often than not, effectiveness is more important than efficiency in national security, for example in war and so on. Okay, how do you evaluate the quality of civil military relations? One is to look at the degree of harmony between civilians and the armed forces. It is recommended to have an intense communication between, for example, the political side and the military, for the military to understand the objective, and for the politician to understand the limits, the restrictions, and what the armed forces can do. This is basically also von Clausewitz's recommendation to have some degree of communication between them. This is also sometimes is criticized, and there are theories of specialists who argue that some degree of critique should exist between these two sectors. The other is the effectiveness of national security policy, and this is also of the often debated, meaning the degree in which the national security policy attains its goals, like to counter and or to prevent threats. The last evaluation criteria is the constitutional balance between, for example, the politicians and the armed forces. This is why we spoke until now. There are also several theories. So Samuel Huntington's institutionalism studies the power of the armed forces, is the ideology from the society, and the degree of professionalism. And based on that, he defines several types, and he uses these types to study history in contemporary civil military relations. The most important prescription was, as we spoke before, the objective control, in which the military is subordinated but it has its own autonomy. The second theory is that of Maurice Yanovitz, who was a sociologist, so basically is the founder of military sociology, which is an important branch of research. And Maurice Yanovitz argued that this separation between civilian side and military side is overrated, and especially in countries like United States, there's more communications, more influence from the overall society upon the military than it is usually assumed by Samuel Huntington's theory. So basically, uh, these two theories were some kind of the opposite spectrum. Another explanation is the principal agent theory by in version of Paul Fever. This is, comes from economics and democracy theory. So we have like the citizens, or let's say the legislators, who have the citizens, and they delegate their power to some organization, for example, the state or the government. And the problem for principal agent theory is how the citizens control the agency. The agent, because it's an economic theory, has the tendency to grow his power and to spend the resources for his own goals, which are not always the same as the one of the principal. So, how to make them coordinate better? The classical recommendation is to have good quality monitoring. So, for example, in case of civil military relations, we must have professional committees who understand how the armed forces function. So this is basically the main recommendations. The last theory is called concordance theory, and argues that the politicians and the armed forces should converge on several issues, like the chain of command, or the composition of the officer corps, the mission, and so on. So these are basically the four alternatives for explanations, and there are also prescriptions, like policies, conclusions based on each theory. Now the conclusions. Why do we speak about civil military relations? One, because of normative reasons, because we are interested in the quality of democracy and so on, but also to better understand strategy. Because in the first video, spoke about issue of institutionalization and ownership. To understand who is the responsible for certain strategic action, we need to understand how civil military relations work and who does what. The second conclusion is that even today the issue of civilian control is important. It's important since Plato, and probably will be important in the future. And even if its importance fluctuates when democracy is under threat, or when there is a lot of uncertainty, then people speak about civilian control, so issues related to civilian control. The main solution proposed by the literature is to emphasize professionalizations, meaning the armed forces should be in, have a lot of authority, but under a specific sphere, and they shouldn't go beyond that sphere. All these theories which we spoke before are incomplete and are contested, and they are based on, let's say, American experience or Western experience, and they don't always work if you take them outside this context. There are several research teams, for example, issue of authority and power, problems of legitimacy and morality, the missions, the how they are recruited, the efficiency and the effectiveness. There is also a normative evaluation side, which is based on political, ethical, and professional criteria. So we can look at the, uh, let's say, civil military relations in one country from a democratic point of view or from a, let's say, a national security point of view, and they are not contradictory, but they are kind of different criteria. And the last conclusion is that we still need to study Samuel Huntington's theory because it's often discussed by academics, but it's also recommended in practice. So the projects of reform were influenced by his ideas. Now, there are several review or, if you want, debate issues, like, are civil military relations still important? So why do we speak about Samuel Huntington's and other theories from the 1950s and 1960s? And we shouldn't look for better theories or for better research questions? And the second, but more focused debate is how useful is Samuel Huntington's today. For example, there are several critics who said that his theory is obsolete, and is not just obsolete; it's dangerous, and so we need better options. And others who say that it's still influential, and we still need to take him into account. The third review question or issue: how do we link the development of the modern state and the civil military research agenda? Because if you look from a historical point of view, we see that they kind of went together. We see that in discussion about from Clausewitz, and the discussion from the first seminar about the institutionalization of strategic decision. Another issue is, should we include non-state actors in this field of research? I mean, should we take, for example, contractors? Should we hold them responsible for what they do in war zones and the other type of non-state actors? And the last and probably one of the most important issue is, how strong is the idea of democratic civil military relations, which is, all these theories have this idea that the civilian side should be the most important one, and the military side should be the one who basically uh, pursue political goals and doesn't interfere in democratic governing. So this is basically the normative side. All these theories share it, but all these theories which you spoke have different solutions. Okay, that was all for you today. Hope you liked the video. If you do, please like and share and comment. Thank you all. Have a nice day.